What if the oldest stories ever told, passed down by every civilization on Earth, from ancient Mesopotamia to the Amazon jungle, were all remembering the same catastrophe? A world that was swallowed whole. A civilization that vanished without. A trace and a warning that the survivors carved into clay, stone, and memory so that we would never forget. This is the story of what came before the flood. Every culture on Earth has a flood myth. That is not a coincidence. The ancient Sumerians wrote about it over 4,000 years ago. The Hindus have a version that predates the Bible. Indigenous peoples across North America, Southeast Asia, and Sub-Saharan Africa, all of them, carry stories of a great water that came and erased what was before. Modern science tells us that massive flood events have occurred throughout human prehistory. Sea levels rose dramatically at the end of the last ice age, roughly 12,000 years ago, swallowing coastlines and reshaping continents. But here is the question that historians and archaeologists still cannot fully answer. What or who was lost when those waters rose? Tonight we are going back to the edge of recorded history. We are going to examine what ancient texts actually say, what the geological record reveals, and what strange discoveries keep surfacing from the deep, because the world before the flood may be far more complex than we ever imagined. To understand the flood, you first have to understand what preceded it. Around 12,000 years ago, Earth was in the final stages of the last great ice age. Glaciers covered vast portions of North America and Europe. Sea levels were dramatically lower, as much as 400 feet below where they are today. This means that enormous stretches of coastline, now submerged beneath the ocean, were once dry land. In the Persian Gulf, there was no gulf at all. It was a fertile river valley, a place that some researchers have theorized could have supported dense human populations. In the North Sea, between Britain and continental Europe, lay a landmass archaeologists now call Doggerland, forests, rivers, and wetlands that are today buried under 130 feet of water. These were not marginal, inhospitable places. They were, by all geographic indicators, ideal land for early human settlement. Now here is where the story turns unsettling. If human civilizations existed in these coastal zones, and the evidence of stone tools and ancient structures recovered from the ocean floor suggests they did, then the flood was not just a natural disaster. It was an erasure, a reset. Entire communities, entire ways of life, entire libraries of oral tradition and cultural memory, pulled beneath the sea. And the people who survived were left to make sense of it all. Long before the biblical account of Noah, there was Utnapishtim. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the oldest written stories in human history, etched into clay tablets in ancient Sumer over 4,000 years ago. A great god warns a man that a flood of overwhelming proportions is coming. The man builds a vessel. He loads it with animals, craftsmen, and family. The waters rise, everything else dies. Sound familiar? What is striking is not the story itself, but how old it is. The Gilgamesh flood narrative predates the biblical book of Genesis by at least 1,000 years. And both stories share near identical details. Scholars debate whether one borrowed from the other, or whether both are drawing from an even older, shared memory of a real event. Then there is the Vedic tradition of ancient India. The Matsya Purana tells the story of Manu, a sage warned by a fish, an avatar of the god Vishnu, of a coming deluge. Manu builds a great boat and survives. The world is reborn through him. In ancient Greece, it was Deucalion. In Mesoamerica, the Maya wrote of multiple world ages, each one ending in catastrophe, one of them by water. These are not related civilizations. They had no known contact with one another, and yet the story persists, almost word for word, across 10,000 miles and dozens of centuries. What are the odds that every single one of them simply made it up? Here is the part of the story that tends to get left out. In the Sumerian King List, a remarkable ancient document that records the rulers of early Mesopotamian civilization, there is a clear and eerie division. Before the flood, the Kings are listed as ruling for tens of thousands of years each. After the flood, the numbers drop dramatically. Suddenly, kings are ruling for decades, not millennia. Mainstream historians classify the pre-flood reigns as mythological exaggeration, and that is a reasonable position. But other scholars, and this remains a theory, not established fact, suggest that these pre-flood rulers may represent dynasties, family lines, or tribal traditions compressed into single figures, stretched across generations of oral retelling. What both groups agree on is this: there is a before and an after. A hard break in the human record. There is also the mystery of the Younger Dryas, a period of rapid catastrophic climate change that occurred around 12,900 years ago. For roughly 1,200 years, temperatures plummeted. Then, just as abruptly, they rose again. Glaciers melted at a staggering rate. Some researchers, controversially, have proposed that this event was triggered by a cosmic impact. Fragments of a comet or asteroid striking the North American ice sheet, triggering a firestorm and a cascade of climate effects that included massive flooding. To be clear, this is a hypothesis. It is debated. The evidence is compelling to some scientists and contested by others. But consider what it would mean if it were true. A civilization, perhaps not a complex empire, but a sophisticated network of coastal communities, existing before this event would have been virtually obliterated, not slowly, not in generations, overnight, and the people who survived would have watched their entire world drown. They would have told their children, and their children would have told theirs. In 2001, off the coast of the Gulf of Kambat in western India, oceanographers made a discovery that sent a quiet shock through the archaeological community. Using sonar imaging, they found what appeared to be the geometric remains of a submerged city. Regular structures, right angles, what might be the foundations of buildings, sitting 130 feet below the surface of the sea. Sediment samples brought up from the area were later carbon dated to an extraordinary age, approximately 9,500 years old. That would make any settlement at that location older than Mesopotamia, older than Egypt, older than any civilization in the conventional archaeological timeline. The discovery is disputed. Marine archaeologists have debated whether the structures are natural rock formations or evidence of human construction. Without a proper underwater excavation, which has not yet occurred, no definitive conclusion can be reached. But this is not an isolated case. Off the coast of Japan, near the island of Yonaguni, lies an underwater rock formation that some researchers believe is a man-made step pyramid. Off the coast of Cuba, researchers claimed in the early 2000s to have identified stone structures in deep water that could represent a submerged city. In the Mediterranean, submerged ancient ports and structures have been found at numerous locations. Each of these sites carries its own controversy, its own unanswered questions, but together they form a picture of a world that existed before the sea rose, a world we have barely begun to look for. Most of Earth's archaeology has focused on the land, but if the most habitable, most densely populated zones of the ancient world were coastal, and all the evidence suggests they were, then the majority of early human history may literally be underwater, waiting to be found. So what do we actually know? We know that catastrophic floods occurred. Geology confirms it. Sea levels rose, coastlines vanished. Entire habitable landmasses were swallowed by the sea, and this happened within the span of human memory. Within the last 12,000 years, we know that people lived through it. Every human alive today carries the DNA of survivors. And we know that the memory of what happened was so powerful, so fundamentally world-altering, that cultures on opposite ends of the earth independently encoded it into their most sacred stories. What we do not fully know is what was lost. We do not know how sophisticated the societies of the pre-flood world truly were. We do not know what they built, what they understood, what they passed on. We assume that ancient means primitive. We assume that complexity only arrives late, with writing, with cities, with bronze. But that assumption is increasingly being challenged. Göbekli Tepe, a monument in modern Turkey built by hunter-gatherers over 11,000 years ago, before farming, before any known civilization, is proof that human capacity for monumental construction is older and stranger than we thought. And Göbekli Tepe is on land. It survived. Most of what came before it, built on the shorelines, the river valleys, the low-lying fertile coasts, did not. The flood is not just a myth, it is a scar. A scar written into the stone of every continent, preserved in the language of every culture, and encoded into the deepest parts of the human story. Something was here before us. Something was lost, and somewhere, beneath the dark water of forgotten seas, the evidence still exists, waiting for the right question, the right technology, the right moment of discovery. Perhaps the flood did not end civilization. Perhaps it only buried it. If you want more stories from humanity's forgotten past, subscribe to Mythic Origins. Every week, we go back, further back than the history books dare.